All right, we're on our way. Okay, so before we start, any questions? We're going to talk about urbanization and suburbanization in the US today. And then we're also going to just start discussing globalization as well. Any questions? Hopefully everybody got their vote in already. It's that day. All right. You can pull out the popcorn later and get ready for the fun, right? Okay. All right, so we are now, yeah, what fun. We are not going to discuss urbanization and then globalization in the United States. And so let me share the lecture notes which have been posted. I think all our Zoom lectures are now up to date. I just uploaded all of them today, so you should have all of them now. Okay, you have your second reading quiz, which is up and running. So I think hopefully we are, for the most part, caught up. Matthew says, for reals. I don't know what that means, but whatever that is, though everyone stay safe. Okay. For real. Oh, for real. Okay, for reals. Yeah, that's true. Remember, if you encounter an aggressive liberal or conservative, just don't say anything. Keep your opinions to yourself for the next few days. Be safe. I agree with Matthew. It's not worth the confrontation when nerves are pretty raw, you know? I've had some of my own family members who have announced to me that they're going on a incommunicado, a hiatus for the next day or two because they're kind of wound up so tightly. So I completely understand that. All right, let me share my lecture notes with you. We, on the other hand, have work to do, right? Study important things like urbanization in the US. It's the wrong one. Oops, hold on a second. Give me one more second here. Okay, does everybody see the slide UPP 40, urbanization in the US in front of them? All right, cool. So this is looking at the US population and urban population, you know, starting in the 1700s right here. So the blue is the US population and the orange is the urban population. And so the total US population and the urban population in the 1700s right after independence, right? Not that much of a difference. So what this really indicates is that most of the population was rural right here, with the gray line. As you move forward, right around this time period, mid-1800s, you have what is the commonly known as the Industrial Revolution. A prior Industrial Revolution had occurred also in the 1700s, but this is sort of the big one in London, right? And so you have this radical shift from rural parts of the country to the urban parts, and this is occurring all over Europe, and it's starting to occur, albeit in a bit delayed way, also in the United States. So what you see right here in the mid-1800s is a rapid rise in the urban population. Okay, the rural population also, of course, goes up, right? But the urban, which has been mostly flat till the 1850s, you see the 1850s right here, starts to really, really take off. And you know, as we're heading now towards the midpoint of this century, you know, you have something like 60–70% of the U.S. population, maybe more actually, depending on the region, that is urban. So we are decidedly an urban nation now, as is much of the developed world. Okay. Same time period, you look at the urban and rural split, and you start to see that there's a decline in the rural population and an uptick in the urban population. Okay, so we just took the census. Here is the 1790 census, some historical data. And what do you see here? Stolen from Wikimedia, which got it from the US Census. But what do you see here is the population of New York, 33,000 in 1790, right? That's not even as big as a small mid-tier city in the United States today, very small. So you fast forward through this whole thing, get to the 1900s, New York now is 3.5 million, which is bigger in 1900s than the city of LA is today, right? So New York is, of course, the most rapidly urbanizing population. San Francisco, 342,000, which is roughly the size of Anaheim, okay, give or take today. So, and 2010 census, LA, the greater LA area, 3.7. This is a little bit, should be a little bit less for the LA city. But New York, the greater New York City area, 8.1 million, or nearly 8.2 million folks. And the smallest of the big cities, San Jose, California, the star right here, is almost 1 million people, right? Who knew that San Jose was that big? Wow, crazy. All right, so what are the characteristics of suburbanization in the United States? So far, you know, you were reading all of these seminal texts in sociology that really talk about the shift from the town, or from the village to the town to the cities, right? And then what are the implications of that? And different theorists that you're reading have different takes. Some, you know, like Wirth are like, well, you know, the city is really big and heterogeneous, and it has all this complexity, but also has, you know, all these issues that come up with it. Overstimulation of the nervous system. You have specialization, you have thousands of people, but you also have a high degree of anomie, right? Anomie. You have interdependence, but you have a fraying of loyalties. You are a stranger among other strangers, and the ties that bind are increasingly weakened in the urban area, right? And you have others who are suggesting things like, yeah, that does happen, but urbanization also sets the individual free, both from the bonds of village and communal life. You're allowed to form thriving subcultures. These are the last set of readings, not the last, but the second to last. And in these thriving subcultures, people belong to maybe one or more of these, but they intersect other subcultures as well. So in some ways, city life is liberating, and in other ways, it creates anomie or interdependence, but at the same time, a rootlessness, a place where somebody has all the amenities in the world, but they don't have any strong kinship ties anymore. Those have been dislocated or frayed as a result of the move towards urban areas. So this is the trade-off. What is the positive side of that trade-off? What do we get from moving to cities? We get access to lots of markets, right? Markets. And we get markets for everything, every good and service imaginable. What are these goods and services? They are for things like bread and butter. They're also for things like finding a partner in life, finding a babysitter if you have children, right? The markets for just about everything in a city. And the quality of product that you get in a city or an urban area is much higher. Why is that? Because you have many producers of the same product. Right? So you have variety, you have choice. You, in your common sense probably tells you this, you could go to a rural area, you might have one shop in a small village or a small town. One shop that sells everything. If they decide to gouge you, or if they decide to run out of some product that you need, you're out of luck, right? You only have one place to go. So in the city, in an urban area, you have many more choices. So that's the trade-off, that your welfare. Now, I'm not saying your happiness, right? Happiness is a question that is very difficult to answer. It lies outside of the purview of economics, for example. Although the foundation of all economics is that all individuals act rationally to increase their own utility, right? Utility. What is your own utility? Presumably, it's your happiness. It's the foundation of all economics, but then they kind of stopped talking about it. I mean, there's a whole field called happiness economics and whatnot, but in general, they're more comfortable talking about things like utility. And so your welfare is increased. By welfare, we mean you have access to stuff. That's increased in an urban area. And you have access to multiple markets. You have access to subculture. What's the trade-off? You have anomie, you have alienation, you have increasing difference between the haves and the have-not, right? You have, if you remember your Marxian text, David Harvey, for example, that I covered last week, talks about the class conflicts that inevitably engendered in an urban smart capitalist economy, right? And so on. So there's the good and then there's the bad. And that's what some of these theorists are starting to now talk about. Naturally, the question you are asking yourself now is, well, is it inevitable, these bad things? And the second question is, if it's not inevitable, then what can be done about it, right? To create a urban environment where we minimize the negative aspects of the urban environment, and while keeping some of the more positive aspects of the urban environment, right? And why is this question important? Well, sometimes when you're talking about things like poverty policy, right, and you're having a discussion at your house or over the dinner table or something like that, inevitably, you know, if the group is large enough, you'll get somebody who says, well, you know, it's part of the human condition. There are going to be haves and have-nots. And they're kind of resigned to that statement, right, or that state of affairs, that human beings, by their very nature, are competitive. And some people are just going to not have stuff, and others are going to have stuff. And sometimes it's just bad luck, and that's just the way it is. And just accept it, and just look out for yourself, and don't give a flying hoot about anybody else. And that's the way to be. So get some variation of that argument, right? And then others will make arguments like, and they'll use the word they without really specifying who the they is, right? They should fix the system. They should take care. They should address the environmental concerns. They should take care of all the poor people, the homeless, man. The policymakers, the folks in the city, city council, the elected officials, they should take care of it. So responsibility again is sort of shifted off to this nebulous, ambiguous they, right? So depending on who you talk to, you'll get some variation of these kinds of, you know, what I think are pretty asinine arguments, in the sense that they don't really leave much avenue for change, right? So anytime you're discussing something with somebody and they end up basically saying that, well, that's just how things are, and you know, you can't do anything about it, or things can be improved, but it's not in my hands, right? You have one of two options. I mean, if you got, you know, 2 hours to kill at a party, you might as well engage them, right? Or you can just go, and then walk away. Because it doesn't, you know, at that point, you're not really engaging somebody who is thinking about, in my opinion, at least, the problem critically, okay? So we have this phenomena that's occurring in the United States, suburbanization, urbanization. And then you have a phenomena that is sort of a corollary phenomena, or something that is occurring not exactly simultaneously, but almost simultaneously, and that is suburbanization or ex-urbanization. So we have urban areas, then we have suburban areas, and then we have ex-urban areas, right? All this terminology that is developed in the planning disciplines. And what is the difference between urban and suburban? Really, it's density, okay? Density. So a city like Irvine, for example, if I was to ask you, a city like Irvine, is it urban or is it suburban? What would you say? Suburban. Yeah, I mean, for the most part, you are on the right track. But Irvine, believe it or not, in the grand scheme of urban areas in the United States, it's pretty urban, and it's considered a medium to high density city, right? I know, and you're thinking to yourself, what? I've been to high density place, and let me tell you, you ain't no high density place, Irvine, right? You're thinking that to yourself, right? But Irvine is kind of a medium high to high density place. Certainly in the commercial corridor, right, where the high-rise buildings are, and the reason being is, yeah, I'll get to that in a second, Matthew. Who's considered suburban? Parts of Irvine could be considered suburban. who's considered suburban? A way of looking at that is who's considered not suburban or urban, right? And we're talking about population densities that are at that point that are approaching like 1 person an acre, 2 persons an acre or less. Where do you get these kinds of densities? Like, you know, what is now a beautiful toss-up state in the parlance of CNN, our good friend Texas with no income tax and the wild, wild west. Parts of Texas are very, very rural, or parts of Texas are also very, very urban. And then parts of Texas are very, very suburban as well, right? Depending on where you are. As you move farther to the Midwest, into the agricultural regions, you are decidedly in rural areas, right? Where you have population densities that are below 0.5 person an acre, right? You have population densities that are very, very low. Because when you move to Irvine, on the other hand, you can start to get, for example, in Irvine, in the planned urban development units in Irvine, PUDs, you'll have a 2,000 square foot home on maybe 4,000 to 5,000 square foot lot, right? That is roughly, you'll have something like 6 or 7 of those lots in 1 acre, and 3 to 4 people per home. You're looking at something like 28 to 30 people per acre in Irvine, in a typical PUD, planned urban development area, right? So that is not low density by any means of the imagination, any stretch of the imagination. Earlier, Matthew asked, what would you consider suburban? Again, it's somewhat subjective. When you start getting into densities that are a little bit lower than that, you know, what are the areas in Southern California that would be considered decidedly suburban? As you head out into the Inland Empire, those are actually the suburbs of the suburbs, right? Excuse me. Places like Ontario, Fontana, Chino, although they are becoming more urban. Parts of Chino and Chino Hills are becoming much more developed and urban as well. Pomona. As you head into these areas, you become decidedly much more suburban, and we also use the term exurbs also to sort of describe their relationship to the city core. What is the city core? The city core is Los Angeles. Okay. You know, a few years ago when the Anaheim Angels were bought, the new owner changed their name to the Los Angeles Angels of Anaheim or something like that. It pissed everybody off, right? And the reason being he did that was because Los Angeles is the center of the Southern California universe. And changing that name increases the market share, in his mind, of viewers and fans for the Anaheim Angels. And of course, the Anaheim Angels, their fan base is pretty rabid, and they were pretty pissed off. Understandably so, right? They're like, we have nothing to do with Los Angeles. They got the Dodgers, who, by the way, won recently, right? And so these areas, nonetheless, are considered the suburbs and exurbs of the greater LA metropolitan area. But if you're using strict definitions, for example, what the U.S. Census does, it breaks these areas up into what are called metropolitan statistical areas, MSAs. And you have a few in the greater LA area. You have the Santa Ana area, that's an MSA, Irvine's part of that. You also have the Long Beach area. That's a pretty major area as well. Then you have sort of the Glendale, Burbank area. I don't know if you guys have been up that far, right, by the 210, 134 freeway. And then, of course, you have the big daddy in the room, right, which is LA, the LA area, which is downtown LA. And then you have the Pasadena area as well, which you can kind of view as sort of part of the Burbank Glendale nexus as well. They're close, they're not exactly next to each other, but they're pretty close. So you have some major metropolitan areas in the greater LA area. But if we were to look at it in terms of a gravity models, transportation theorists use this all the time, and it's basically the area that with the greatest population and densities are kind of in the middle, and the other areas are outside of it. So LA is that center of the universe, and we define urban basically anything that would be in that greater LA area. So Irvine would be very urban. Now, that being said, there are parts of Irvine that are more suburban than urban, right? Because you have larger homes, larger lot sizes, lower population density, right? when we talk about an area like New York, I bet most of you are thinking in your minds, when we say urban, we're thinking a place like New York or London or something like that, right? Those are hyper dense urban areas. Okay, in New York, you could have densities that are in the hundreds per acre, depending on the size of the skyscraper that the building is, the height of the building that is built on that particular lot of land. The Greater Manhattan area, of course, is very land constrained, and high rises are allowed there, and so you have extremely high population densities. One of the reasons that public transportation works in an area like New York or even London and other places that have very high population densities is because public transportation doesn't really pay for itself unless you have certain densities. And those densities simply do not exist in most parts of Southern California. They exist in certain parts of Los Angeles, for example, along major corridors. What are the major corridors in Los Angeles? If you've ever taken a trip down the Wilshire corridor, for example, major corridor in Los Angeles. By corridor, I mean like a long street that just runs north to south or east to west, right? So public transportation tends to work in areas like that. But you go to an area like Irvine, forget it. Even though Irvine is kind of medium-high density, medium high to high, depending on area, the topographical layout of Irvine, where you have all these sort of winding streets that don't intersect in right angles, makes it very difficult for people to address that last mile problem, meaning where they live and where the bus stop is are sometimes miles apart. You can't exactly, like walking to the bus stop will take you 2 or 3, 2 or 3 miles sometimes. And it doesn't make sense, right? And the densities simply aren't there. Okay, so over the years, the definite trend has been towards, at the very least in the United States, suburban development. And then in some places, medium to high urbanization, okay? All right, going back to the lecture again. Some features of suburbanization are listed here. And I'm kind of giving you a history of suburbanization. So, you have high population density. We mentioned that. You have a mixture of functions. This is, again, the history, not today, because today's zoning, basically, unless you have mixed use zoning, you have areas that are dedicated to residential and commercial. This is sort of the historical development of suburbanization in the US, okay? In the beginning, when New York developed, you had a lot of wealthy factory owners who basically decided to get out of Dodge. They got tired of walking in horse poop all the time. And so they kind of moved out to these garden cities. They built their castles outside. And that, in some ways, ushered in this idea that you could have this nice suburban house somewhere far from the city core, right? And come into the city once in a while to tend to your business. But the city was not viewed as a desirable place to live. Because the city had what are called, the equivalent of slums in New York would be the tenements. They had tenements for the poor people at that time. And then they had the workers who used to live in mixed use places. In other words, they lived at the top and the factory and the shop were at the bottom. So they kind of lived where they worked, right? And before the automobile, people either walked, rode their bicycles, or took horse-drawn carriages or trams, horse-drawn. And so as a result, the areas were kind of beset with disease and congestion. And if you could afford to, you moved out to a garden city, just kind of left and moved somewhere else. And it led to a few other trends, and I mentioned them here. It sort of led to this idea that you have the distinction between private space and public space. See, if you go to an area like New York, as I mentioned this in the context of the Jane Jacobs reading, if you're sitting out on your porch, let's say on your brownstone or something like that, the difference between a public area and a private area, it's very permeable. What does that mean? It means that people can kind of come into the front part of the building, even the common hallways, even though they're technically inside the building where you live. It's not strange to have strangers there, right? Maybe they're delivering stuff, maybe you're the mailman, whatever it is, right? On the other hand, if you look at a typical suburban R1 single family home, people can't really linger in your front yard or your patio unless they're the mailman, right? And the mailman can only linger for a few seconds dropping the mail off, and then he or she must also leave. There's a strict delineation between private and public space. That doesn't exist to the same degree when you have higher density developments of the type you did when New York was first entering or in the throes of the Industrial Revolution. Like, that simply didn't exist there. So when sort of the upper middle class or the richer folks moved out to these garden city type places, this notion that private space in residential areas, this became much more important. And then coupled to that, you had and here I'm smashing together literally decades, by the way. So I'm kind of going from like mid to late 1800s to the earlier part of the 19th century here, right? So you got like 50, 60 years smashed together. But I'm trying to give you the general trends that that occurred at that time. You had the development of, so the thing that I'm trying to get at here is, let me stop sharing this. Several things have to happen for this typical suburban area that you notice today when you go out to Irvine or Anaheim or any of the major cities that are nearby. It's a very typical type of development that you see, right? And for that to occur, certain things had to happen. And these things were limited not just to one sphere of activity in society. These things had to occur in the economic sphere, in the political sphere, in the planning sphere, right? And also in the philosophical sphere. What do I mean by that? Okay, and also the engineering spheres. What do I mean by that? This is what I mean by that. The idea that your home is your castle is an idea. There's nothing particularly real about that idea. It's just an idea that we hold now in this country, certainly, because we are based on property ownership. Okay, so I want you to appreciate this, right? We are a property ownership based society. The Constitution contains many provisions that speak to that directly, actually, right? And there's a takings clause, for example, in the Constitution. I'll cover that in a second. That discusses the deprivation of private property through processes like eminent domain and what the government must do to make you whole if they're taking your private property. So private property is an essential part, we might say the sine qua non, or the essential element of being American, owning property, right? So what does owning property means? It means that there's a whole bundle of rights that come with ownership. You have the right to basically tell people to not use your property. You have the right to use your property as you see fit within certain regulations. You have the right to kick people off your property. In some places, the right to kick people off your property using force, right? There's a whole bundle of rights that come with you being a property owner. And these rights are, they deal with the property on the surface of the land. They deal with rights that are below the land, and they deal with rights that are above the land, airspace as well, right? So our property ownership system is pretty well defined through the legal system over the years, right? And because of that, you, me, everybody else who sort of grows up in the United States grows up thinking that it's very natural to own things, and it's very natural to own things and have rights to those things. But there is nothing particularly natural about that. There are other cultures who had something called a usufructuary conception of land, meaning like, hey, if you're, for example, a nomadic group of people, right? What are nomads? Nomads, they kind of hang out in a place and they do their business. What is their business? Getting food usually, right? And then they move on. They move on with whatever animal they happen to be hunting or with the seasons, right? So if you're a nomad, you stay in one place for a bit and then you move on. You don't own that land, right? You have a concept of land which is very much like use it and then move on, so others can also use it later, right? That is not the concept we have here. So that is a philosophical difference, basically, between a property ownership-based society and one that is not. But the point I'm trying to make, and one that you should understand, is that there's nothing natural about that, right? Like if, let's say, forget about your house and your land. Like let's say, I'm drinking my drink right here, right? Walking down the street and somebody just walks up to me and just kind of, and say, hey, I'm thirsty, do you mind? Just takes it and goes. Okay, and what would I do? My first instinct would be to say like, dude, what are you doing? That's mine. Okay. And then let's say this person asked me, oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were done because you weren't, I was watching you walk down the street and you weren't really drinking from it. You just kind of were holding on to it. And I'm like, yeah, I was done. I don't want any more because I was satiated. And he's like, okay, then what's the problem? I just had a sip, you were done. Why can't I have it? And I'm like, but it's not yours. And then he keeps telling me, but you're done drinking it. You're not drinking anymore. And then I keep arguing, yes, but it's mine, I don't care. I have the right to let you not use it, even though you're thirsty, right? So you get kind of where I'm getting at, right? That there's something fundamental about ownership that we believe instinctively growing up in this culture, okay? So that is a philosophical thing. And that has evolved over time. It is enshrined. By enshrined, I mean what? It is articulated clearly in the Constitution of the United States of America, all right, and its various amendments. It's there. There are, the right to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, right? All that stuff. If you read text of the Constitution, it speaks very clearly to own property ownership as well, right? Because it was essential to the foundation of this country. So philosophical things, but there's nothing natural about it. Second thing, economic, okay? What is the economic underpinnings of suburbanization? The economic underpinnings have to do with a technological and a resource-based thing. And so let me go back to the lecture again. Notes again. So we talked about private space, right? We talked about the notion of ownership. But the technical thing that was sort of essential to suburbanization in the US is something called balloon frame housing coupled with the self-amortizing mortgage, okay? Balloon frame housing and self-amortizing mortgage, and balloon frame housing using wood, right? So you have an engineering technology, which is wood and balloon frame housing. Let me type this up properly. That's an engineering technology. Frame housing. And you have a policy innovation. What's a policy innovation? It's a nice new regulation type thing that the government came up with, which is mortgage amortization. And an increase in the loan to value ratios of the mortgage. Okay, what does all that mean? Here's a simple answer. If we build housing out of concrete, everybody's familiar with concrete, right? And you go to most other cultures, they kind of sometimes come to Southern California in particular, especially folks who are like from, let's say, the Middle East or parts of Asia, and they kind of look at the housing and you're like, hey, in Irvine, here's a 2,500 square foot house. That's like $1.3 million. And they're like, what? What is it made out of? That's the second question. You're like, wood. And then they go, okay. And they kind of laugh underneath their breath, like, yeah, wood, and it's $1 million, right? Because other places build stuff out of brick. They build stuff out of concrete, sometimes steel, but concrete and brick mostly. Wood is viewed as an inferior product, right? And here we are building out of wood. But what is the benefit of wood? It's amazing for earthquake country. Really good for earthquake country. What's the benefit of wood? It goes up really fast from an engineering standpoint. What's the other benefit of wood? If you get tired of your house looking a certain way, you can cut, paste, literally change it around in a matter of weeks. You're like, you know what? I want to expand my kitchen. I'm going to blow out this wall. Is it a load-bearing wall? No, it's not. Take out the wall. Hire some guy who's legal to do the kind of job, or do it yourself, right? By the way, I don't recommend you ever blowing out any wall yourself. Disclaimer. Hire somebody who can legally do this, i.e. a licensed contractor who knows what they're doing. My disclaimer for the day. Okay. You know, but you don't want to go around your house guessing which is a load-bearing wall. Never want to play that game, because you know one day you're sleeping and you're like, huh, my roof is caving in, right? Don't play that game. The engineering technology that comes with using wood and balloon frame housing, which basically gives us the capacity to build 2 stories fairly quickly. It's doing a type of framing, which framing is the basic, like the 2x4s, 2x6s, 2x12s, 4x4s, and so on, that are used to build a basic residential structure, right? If you ever walk by a construction site, all you see is this beautiful Douglas fir wood everywhere. That is, you know, the skeleton of the development. You know, I like looking at it, right? Because you know, like you can kind of envision, like, oh, what's going to go in there? There's the insulation, there's the sheathing, and you picture all the people doing their family things and shopping. Like, what is it going to look like, right, in the future? And it makes you really happy, and a warm, fuzzy feeling travels up there. Anyway, maybe you don't have the same feeling, but to me, it's a testament to civilization when I see building going on, and it's pretty amazing. So, and also what's amazing is that it happens fairly quickly in areas where we use wood, which is pretty much most parts of the United States, right? Now, with the exceptions, of course, being places like New York and downtown areas where you're building high rises. You cannot build high rises out of wood. There's some engineers who are willing to go as high as 10, 12, 13 stories. Some even higher than that, but in a high seismic area. See, what happens is when a building is really tall, it has a pendulum-like effect. The wind really causes a lot of sway, a lot of deflection at the top. So it doesn't work very well with wood. But anyway, so we have wood frame housing that is coupled with, so the technology is wood, and the policy innovation is mortgage. What does this mean? You see, back in the day, when you had to buy your own house, how did you do it? You're like, well, I bought this piece of land, and I'm going to take 3 months off, and I'm going to build this house out of wood myself. That's kind of how you did it. If you were like, you know, go get them kind of person. If you are like me, who has no skills that are useful and real, you basically paid somebody to do it, right? So you financed the construction of your house and the buying of the land entirely yourself, self-financed. That was the way to do it before. Sometimes you got a loan. Maybe your loan was for like 20% or 30% of the total cost. But the rest, the vast majority, you paid for by yourself, okay? Along comes the federal government, and they're like, you know, we want people to own homes, right? And why do we want people to own homes? This is any idea, any guesses? Why would the federal government want you to own your own house? That's part of it. These are very good starting points, Donatella and Sergio. Property tax. You guys don't really view the government favorably, do you? You immediately went to like, so they can tax us, those damn government. Always taking my money, right? Sorry, I don't know what accent that was. Any other reasons? Like, that's it? You have these people in the government, they're like, you know, we're going to tax these people, so let's create this amazingly complex policy, you know, called the Federal Housing Administration and the self-amortizing mortgages, and we'll insure the mortgages and create secondary markets so we can just tax the houses. Let me ask you another question. Why do most people in the United States, if I could see your hands and I asked you, how many of you want to own your own home? I bet the majority would say yes. Right? So, okay, so tell me, how does it increase prosperity? The home ownership rate in the United States is around 64%. That means 64% of homes are owner occupied. Or 2 out of 3 homes are occupied by someone who owns it with or without a mortgage. Okay? In California, the rate is much lower. I think it's like mid-50s. But nationally, it's around 64%. And this is primarily because of federal policy. Federal government is very much interested in you buying your house. Why is that? So property tax is one part of it. What happens to the value of a home over time? It goes up, right? Exactly. Not by as much, not by that much though. If you adjust the price appreciation, and you can look this up, Case-Shiller index is a good, if you are interested in these kinds of things. It goes up, but not by as much as you might think. Once you adjust the price, for example, if a house costs $500,000 today, $500,000, that is not the same as a house costing $500,000 in 1990, right? Because $500,000 in 1990 goes a lot longer than $500,000 today. You have to factor in something called inflation, right? Right. So if you want to do the math really quickly, I can do it for you. Let's say 500,000 today, assuming 2.5% inflation. So 500,000 today would be $238,000 approximately in 1990, assuming 2.5% inflation. All right, how do you calculate that? Here's a quick 500,000 divided by 1.025 to the power of 30. If you guys run that calculation, you're going to get a number around 238,000. All right, this is just discounting basically. So a house that cost $240,000 in 1990 is a house that costs $500,000 today. That's the same price, right? So you always got to adjust. This is a very key thing, though. You must always adjust prices for inflation, always. Otherwise, you're not comparing apples to apples. You're comparing apples to oranges, all right? So real estate does go up, but it doesn't go up that much. It doesn't go up like 6, 7, 8% a year. It goes up more like maybe 3 to 5% a year, maybe, depending on the area. If you look at prices for the last 100 years. Okay, so that's an excellent answer. So homes go up in value. Excellent. Part 2, property tax. I like that. What are the reasons you guys think that we should? The government is incentivizing the buying of houses. These reasons are a little bit more complex. If you own a home, are you likely to spend money having a nice front yard, backyard? Are you more likely to worry about who's on your street? Are you basically more likely to be engaged in your community? Because why? Are homeowners more or less likely to care about their community? That's the question I'm asking. More, right? Why? Because bad stuff affects them. How? How does it affect them? Thank you, Donatella. Property value. That's it. So homeowners are more likely to be involved with things that impact property value. That's the other notion that the government had. Okay? Okay. What else? And this is the link to the globalization piece. It's a little bit more complex. So let me ask you a more basic question here, okay? So is it good to save or not good to save? Like your income? Yes? Kimberly says yes. Anybody else? I mean, you can guess if I'm asking you this question, there's got to be a trick involved, right? Others don't have an opinion. They're just like, what does saving mean? What is money? It depends on how much you're saving. Okay, the question you should be asking me is, Professor Taiwari, are savings good from whose perspective? Are savings good for you? Yes, of course. You have more money that you can hopefully, well, is it good for you? What if you just save your money? Here, I'm going to give you a small example. You save $100 and you just put it in your bank account. 1 year from now, the bank gives you almost no interest. The interest rate is very low. That $100 will be $100 and 2 cents, something like that, right? Is that a good thing to do? Just put it in the bank account? Oh, there you go. Hey, Kevin hit it on the head here. Okay, so Shiromi also hit. She says no. So I'm going to come back to Kevin's point, but remember what he's saying right now. It's not good to just put $100 in your savings account. Do you know why? Because $100, because of inflation, is now worth. If you have inflation of 2.5%, the $100 today that it sits in your bank account in 2021 is now worth $97.50 because of inflation. So by doing nothing with your $100, just leaving in your bank account, you're actually losing money. I hope that makes sense. Why are you losing money? Because you are not beating inflation. Because last year you could buy something for $100, right? And this year that thing cost $102 because prices go up over time. So last year you could buy the whole thing for $100. This year you're like, I am $2 short. That's inflation. Instead, you should have invested the $100 somewhere. Let's say you put the $100 in the stock market, or you put it in whatever, in even a low yield bond. You might have $102 to $103 at the end of the year. Now you're keeping up with inflation. So $103 1 year from now or $100 today are the same amount of money. That's the point I'm trying to make. Just understand that point. It's a pretty important point, right? So inflation erodes the value of money. So it's not a good idea just to save your money. Okay, so now let's go back to Kevin's point. Why is it good, not good for the economy? So from an individual standpoint, if you just save and don't do anything with that money, bad. From an economy standpoint, if you save, too much savings means what? What are you not doing with that money? What is the opportunity cost of saving? Spending, says Shiromi, exactly. And if you are not spending money, you and I, right? You're not eating out, you're not buying that latest edition of, what is the coolest thing to buy now? You're not buying the latest, I don't know, whatever. What do we buy nowadays? I'm not even sure. I spend most of my money on like food, if I'm being honest. Yeah, so whatever clothes, for example, maybe, I don't know. So the opportunity cost of saving is not spending money. So in countries like China has a very high savings rate, at least compared to the US. And that's a problem. The Chinese government is like, we have to keep exporting things outside because the Chinese don't buy stuff as much inside. But if the Chinese reduce their savings rate by even 3 or 4%, 2 or 3% per year, they would develop their internal economy a lot more. They would be less reliant on exports, right? So savings can be good. However, too much savings is bad for the economy. Wow, crazy, right? Everything that your parents told you growing up, save your money. And I'm telling you, no, don't do that. Go out, if you're going to be good little capitalists, and certainly living in Irvine, you should always consider this. You should be like, am I fulfilling my duty as a good little capitalist, right? And you should be sad if you're not, because you need to do your duties living here in these great United States of America. You need to go and spend your money. If you have $100, spend $105. Spend $5 you don't have. It's okay. A government does it and you can do it too. How? Through credit, right? Okay, for those of you, you know me, I am joking right now. If you don't, I am joking, disclaimer. Got to put that out there. Professor Taiwari said I should spend $5 more than I have. But from an economic standpoint, if you got $100, you should be spending a lot of it. Not all of it, but a lot of it, right? Because other people could use your money. And so what Kevin was saying earlier is completely true. Too much savings means bad for the economy, right? So how does the government get you to save and get you to spend money at the same time? One of the ways actually is by getting you to buy a house. Think about it, right? You own a house, it goes up in value, hopefully over time. House goes up in value 5% a year, 6% a year. Subtract inflation, it's still growing up by 3% a year. So you have a savings rate of 3% of your house. And you're at the same time, you are now spending money. Your income on other awesome things like video games and Cheetos or whatever else. And then you're also more involved in your community. Why are you more involved in your community? Because you're like, I own this house, it's going up in value. Hey, I better take care of my front lawn, right? I better show up and the city council meeting and vote my interests because my property values are impacted, right? Those kinds of things. So you're also a more involved community member, right? And so all of these things are designed to incentivize home ownership, okay? What's the other thing that incentivizes home ownership? I mentioned that earlier. It's called loan to value. Loan to value. So you have wood. You have a philosophy which says, house is my castle, stay out of it. You have wood frame housing, balloon frame housing made out of wood. You have a banking system that increases the loan to value ratios. What does that mean? It means that the federal government basically said, hey, if we want people to buy homes and we want homes to go up in value, how do you do that? Basically, you have to increase demand for homes. Increasing demand for homes means the price of homes goes up, right? Increasing demand means greater demand, limited supply. Greater demand, limited supply. Supply doesn't go up as much. The price, equilibrium price, goes up as well. Right? Sorry, all the X, that doesn't make any sense, but you know what I mean. So how do we increase demand for housing? The way we increase demand is by making it easier for somebody to buy a house. How do we make it easier for them to buy a house? We basically enable them to put less money in. Right? So if a house costs $100,000, right? For example, with loan to values that are not favorable. In other words, if you had to finance most of that house yourself, not everybody has 80 grand or 100 grand, right, lying around. But how can you do that? You're like, you know what? Let's make sure that you have to put only 20% down, right? So 100,000, what's 20% of that? Is 20,000, right? And the rest is financed by the bank, right? So this is a very typical structure. It is called the 80-20 LTV. Why is it 80-20? If the house costs 100,000, 100K, out of that, 80% is a loan, 20% is the down payment. Right? 80-20 loan to value. Right? 80-20 LTV. There's other structures also. If you're a first-time home buyer, you can get something called an FHA loan. You only have to put 3% down. That's awesome, right? You're like, look, I got a $500,000 house, only putting down $15,000. I'm doing well, right? And so anything, and I don't want to get into the complexities of the mortgage market because that's a whole other bundle of goods there. But the reason we say 20% is sort of the gold standard in the industry, mortgage now, is because if real estate adjusts by the cyclical movement of real estate, which is another way of saying real estate prices go up and down over time, right? If you buy a house for 100,000, next year it might actually be worth 90. Let's say 90,000, right? It could. There's a 10% adjustment in prices. It has happened. In 2007 and 8, when the market collapsed, the adjustment downwards was like 20 to 50%, depending on area. Houses worth $500,000 one year, next year 250,000. Literally, it happened. People are like just shell shocked. But typically, the adjustment is not that big. It's like at the most, it's going to be 10%, 5%, 8%, 15%. So what the government has figured out, and the banks are also sort of on board with this, is that if the house goes from 100 to 90,000, who loses first? You do, because you put down 20,000. It's your 20,000 that is eroded first before the bank's 80,000 is touched, right? The bank gave you 80, you put in 20, that's how you got the 100, right? So it's a way of basically giving you skin in the game, so you just don't walk out of the house and walk out of the mortgage. Right? That's the basic reason that we structure it that way. Now, there's other ways to structure it too. You can get something called secondary mortgages, right? And there's a whole mess of different ways to sort of do this. But I'm giving you the most basic way, which is the 80-20. And there, you can do a 10-10-90 structure. For example, you have 10% down payment. You have a 10% second mortgage and a 10% primary mortgage. You can do that. Back in the day in 2006 and 7, when there was a lot of money floating around, they're like, you know what? Hey, I'm just going to pick on one of you. Kimberly, you look like you're trustworthy. How much money do you think you're going to make next year after you graduate? Just pretend you're graduating, right? This happened in 2007, by the way. Exactly as I'm telling you, it happened. Kimberly's like, I'm majoring in whatever you're majoring in. I think I'm going to make 150,000 when I get out. The bank is like, you look trustworthy. We believe you. Just, okay, we'll give you a loan. Based on 150,000 and 4% interest, Kimberly, we think you can afford a $600,000 house. And now Kimberly is a proud owner of a $600,000 house. These were called stated income loans. They don't do them anymore. All kinds of wacky mortgage practices came out during that time. You had fully financed where nobody had any skin in the game. And so if you and I don't have any skin in the game, you know what ends up happening? If the bank is like, I'll give you a loan for 600, you know how much loan you should take? Take all of it and then leave the country. That's the rational response, actually, from an economic standpoint. Immediately leave the country. Somebody's like, 600, I don't need any paperwork. You're like, yes, I'll be there tomorrow, right? And then leave the country. Again, I'm not suggesting you defraud anybody, disclaimer. Okay, but I think you understand my point, okay? So there are lots of different structures to this whole mortgage thing. However, sorry, the sun is hitting me in the face. I'm gonna step back a little bit. However, all of this was basically designed to increase demand for housing. The minute somebody can put in less money for housing, demand for housing from the public goes up. Why? Because you no longer have to have the full cash to buy housing. So now you got wood frame, you got mortgages, right? You got demand for housing, you got the technology to build a house, and you got the policy that enables the buying of the house, right? Now, what else do you need? You need roads to build a suburban. Like you're like, I want to build a suburban area far from the city. But how do you get there? Roads. Government steps in yet again. We got this. We got this thing. We got this thing called the New Deal. It's amazing. We're just going to build roads. And some of them are going to be to nowhere. But eventually, developers will just buy the lots, chop them up, banks will make loans, and we got this. Government always says we got this. When the bank makes you a loan for $100,000 to buy your house, back then it wasn't 100, it was like $5,000. The government said, we will buy the mortgage from you. See, let's say you're Bank of America or Wells Fargo back in the day, right? And you're like, I'm going to make loans for homes. I want you to appreciate this point. And let's say you're Bank of America and you have $100,000 total to loan out, right? How many people can you lend to if each house costs $5,000? 20, right? 20 times 5,000 is 100,000. After that, Bank of America goes, I got no more money to lend out. So how does Bank of America keep making loans? The government stepped in. They're like, we'll buy the loans off you. Bank of America's like, what? We'll originate the loans, and then the government just bought the loans from them. They were hoping to start what was called the develop the secondary mortgage market. Secondary mortgage market. Never happened. So the government created something called Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to do this. These are the big ones in the secondary mortgage market. They own half of the mortgage, more than half of the mortgages in the United States. Is this amazing? Don't you love our government? They're like, we got this. Every time there's something, we got this. Right? You need to get to your house, we got this. We got the roads. You need a way to buy your house, we got this. Every time we got this. Right? What I want you to appreciate in this story is that the government does welfare, not just for poor people, for everybody. There's welfare like for everybody. Corporate America, middle class, upper middle class, homeowners, non-homeowners. Everybody is just being sort of on the dole. Right? Homeowners too, because no homeowner can buy their house for cash. There's a small percentage that can. They're very wealthy, but the vast majority have to come up with a down payment, right? So the government enabled through things like the New Deal. New Deal was sort of the culmination or the really big social engineering policy for the United States. But the New Deal was basically about, we're stuck in a depression. How do we get out? It's called supply side economics. We'll just build roads to nowhere. When we got all this wood, we'll build housing and we'll create a mortgage market and people will buy homes. And then along comes this amazing man. His name is Henry Ford. He's like, I got the cars to put on these roads. And I'll bust out a car in like 6 months and I'll pay my workers enough money that they can buy a car in I'll bust out a car not in 6 months. I'll pay my workers enough money where they can buy a car in 6 months of pay. Okay, so I've told you a very funny story, which involves Henry Ford, roads, the New Deal, mortgages, wood, frame housing, right? Loan to value. All of these came together basically to create what you and I now know as the American suburban/urban dream, right? And it's an amazing story. Like if you read this story, I've given you like the flashcards version of it. If you are interested, there's a great book called Crabgrass Frontiers by Kenneth Jackson. Crabgrass Frontiers. I've never been so riveted by like a history book that talks about exactly the story I just told you. You're like, my gosh, as you're reading it, you're like, I see the United States forming literally in the pages of this. And it's pretty amazing. And you're left in awe because you're going, wow, this is a pretty grand scale of social engineering. I'm not saying I agree with this. In fact, and I won't comment on this right now, but in some ways, the homeownership push in the US has been disastrous. And what it was supposed to do, it did accomplish it to some degree, but everybody wants to own a home, and not everybody, but the supply has simply not kept up with it in high cost areas. And so people have overbought, and there's too much reliance on homeownership. And this is not the case in other countries, right? But if I can find the article, there's a good article on this, and I'll try to post it. I'll say a few words about it in maybe the next lecture. Yeah, there's a profound housing shortage. I mean, here's the other thing. When people, like, let's say, you graduate college and you kind of work hard, you save up your first $10,000, $20,000, whatever that is, and then you go buy a house, right? And now you're like, oh my God, I want to live in Southern California, first time home buyer. You're going to get a crappy house for $500,000. That's the reality. It's going to be really old. And then now you're locked into that house and you're spending all this time at Home Depot. You know the people who work there by all your Saturdays and Sundays are there, and all your silly conversations are about, I'm narrating you a very typical story, right? About like, hey, what are the deals at Home Depot because my house always needs work, right? Instead, you could have taken that $20,000 or $30,000 and invested it in the stock market 15 years ago when it was really low, and you would have made more money. Better yet, you could have just bought gold and done nothing. It would have made more money than buying a house. Okay, so sometimes the emphasis on home ownership is a bit misplaced, right? And the reasons for that. But what I wanted to describe to you was the story of us, or the United States, and how this great and amazing landscape you see in front of you of suburban/urban single-family homes is because of the result of very specific government policies around home ownership. Okay, I'm going to stop right there. Are there any questions? Okay. No questions? No questions. All right. Okay, so next lecture, I will go over a few more readings. If you haven't taken the quiz, please do so. If you haven't voted, put on a mask. I don't think it's too late yet, is it? 3 more hours left, something like that. And hopefully the world will be around tomorrow. See you soon. Bye-bye. Bye.